The autumn mist clung to the cobbled streets of Aberdeen as the first pale light of dawn touched the spires of St. Nicholas Kirk. The year was 1263, and the Kingdom of Scotland stood at a crossroads between the old Gaelic ways and the new feudal order brought by kings who spoke French and dreamed in Norman stone. In the royal burghs, those chartered towns granted special privileges by the crown, a transformation was taking place that would reshape Scottish society for centuries to come. Along the eastern coastal plain, from Berwick in the south to Inverness in the north, these burghs had become islands of commerce in a sea of rural pastoralism. Edinburgh, Perth, Stirling, Aberdeen, names that would echo through Scottish history, were in these decades little more than clusters of wooden buildings and thatch, their streets unpaved, their defensive walls often incomplete. Yet within these modest settlements a new class was emerging: the burgesses, free men who owed allegiance not to local lords but directly to the king's law. On this particular morning in Aberdeen, the Mercat Cross stood silent witness to an oath-taking ceremony that chroniclers would later describe only in fragments. 7 men stood in the pre-dawn darkness, their hands upon cold steel. They wore no distinctive mantles, no heraldic devices that would identify them to history. The records that survive describe them only as the sworn defenders of the burgh, men who had pledged something more than the standard burgess obligation to maintain arms and take their turn at watch. The ceremony was conducted by the alderman himself, with 4 bailies in attendance. According to a damaged folio discovered in the Aberdeen Burgh records, these men took vows that went beyond the ordinary requirements of burgessship. They swore to defend not merely their own properties or families, but the entire burgh and its chartered liberties. They pledged to answer any call to arms, day or night, and to maintain battle readiness that would make them equal to any knight of the realm. What distinguished this oath from the standard burgess obligations was its permanence and its exclusivity. While all burgesses were required to possess weapons and serve in the burgh's defense when called upon, these sworn defenders formed a standing military cadre, men who trained together, fought together, and answered to a command structure that operated parallel to the civilian burgh government. The alderman who administered the oath that morning was David of Seaton, a man whose name appears repeatedly in royal charters of the period. Historical analysis of his documented activities suggests connections to both the merchant elite and to military orders that had established presence in Scotland during the previous century. The Knights Templar maintained a preceptory at Ballintrodoch in Midlothian. The Knights Hospitaller had holdings across the kingdom. But the organization taking shape in Aberdeen and other burghs was different, rooted not in crusading ideology or papal authority, but in the practical necessities of urban defense in a kingdom that had not yet fully established the rule of law beyond its castle walls. As dawn broke over the North Sea, these 7 men dispersed to their workshops and warehouses, their oath sworn, their weapons blessed. To the casual observer, they were indistinguishable from other prosperous burgesses, weavers, armorers, leatherworkers who had purchased their freedom and their place in the new commercial economy. But in the decades that followed, similar ceremonies would take place in burgh after burgh across Scotland, creating a network of sworn defenders whose existence would be documented only in marginal notes and cryptic references that later scribes would struggle to interpret. The records fall silent after this. No guild registers record their formation. No royal charters acknowledge their authority. They appear in the historical record only as shadows, men who wore no distinctive badges, who left no monuments, who operated in the spaces between the documented hierarchies of medieval power. Within 50 years, their organization would be so thoroughly erased from official memory that modern historians would debate whether they had ever existed at all. But on that autumn morning in 1263, as mist rose from the harbor and fishing boats prepared to put to sea, something had begun that would shape the defense of Scotland's burghs for the next century, an order of protectors who would be remembered, if at all, only by what they defended, never by who they were. To understand the emergence of these burgh defenders, one must comprehend the revolutionary transformation that David I initiated when he established the first royal burghs in the early 12th century. Before his reign, Scotland possessed no true towns in the continental sense. No centers of organized manufacture, no permanent markets, no communities governed by commercial law rather than feudal obligation. The landscape was dominated by scattered agricultural settlements, monastic centers, and the fortified residences of regional magnates. David I, who had spent his formative years at the English court and understood Norman administrative methods, saw urban centers as instruments of royal power. Between 1124 and his death in 1153, he established at least 15 royal burghs, granting them charters that conferred unprecedented privileges. These burghs received the right to hold weekly markets, to collect their own customs, and most significantly, to be judged under burgh law rather than the complex web of Gaelic and feudal jurisdictions that governed the countryside. The inhabitants of these burghs, the burgesses, purchased their freedom. Before a man could engage in trade within a royal burgh, he was required to pay an entry fee, swear an oath to the king, and crucially, possess armor and weapons sufficient to defend the crown's interests. This requirement appears in every surviving burgh charter from the period. A burgess was not merely a merchant or craftsman, he was a fighting man, capable of bearing arms in the king's service. This martial obligation reflected the precarious position of these early burghs. They were commercial outposts in a landscape still dominated by pastoral agriculture and clan-based social organization. The Gaelic-speaking populations of the Highlands and the Norse-influenced regions of the West regarded these new towns with suspicion, centers of foreign influence where French and Flemish merchants settled, where English became the language of commerce, where Norman legal concepts replaced traditional customs. Documentary evidence reveals the constant threat these burghs faced. Royal records from the reign of Alexander II describe raids on Inverness by Highland warriors. English border burghs like Berwick and Roxburgh required permanent defensive garrisons. Even inland burghs such as Perth and Stirling maintained elaborate systems of watches and patrols. The requirement that every burgess maintain weapons and take his turn at guard duty was not ceremonial. It was a survival mechanism. By the mid-13th century, the system had evolved considerably. Burghs had grown in size and wealth. Edinburgh's population may have reached several thousand. Aberdeen had become a major port exporting wool and hides to Flanders and the Baltic. Perth's high street was lined with substantial timber buildings housing prosperous merchants who traded with Norway, France, and the German Hanse cities. With prosperity came vulnerability. The wealth concentrated in these burghs made them attractive targets. More importantly, the burgh populations had become increasingly specialized. Merchants who had never wielded a sword, craftsmen whose skills lay in weaving or metalwork rather than warfare, clerks and administrators whose value lay in their literacy rather than their martial prowess. Yet the legal requirement remained. Every burgess must maintain arms and serve in defense. Contemporary records reveal the inadequacy of this system. Burgh councils issued repeated ordinances requiring burgesses to present their weapons for inspection, suggesting widespread non-compliance. Fines were levied against those who failed to keep proper arms. The annual weapon musters described in the burgh court books reveal varying degrees of preparedness, from wealthy merchants in full mail armor to petty traders with little more than a rusty blade. Within this context, the emergence of a specialized defensive cadre becomes comprehensible. If not all burgesses could be effective warriors, then perhaps a core group could be selected, men who would take on enhanced obligations in exchange for certain privileges, who would train regularly, who would form the nucleus around which the broader burgh militia could rally in time of crisis. The earliest indirect references to such an arrangement appear in the Aberdeen burgh records around 1250. Entries mention the sworn brothers who received exemptions from certain commercial restrictions in return for their service. Similar phrases appear in the fragmentary records of Perth and Stirling from the same period. In Edinburgh, references to those who keep the watch suggest an organization beyond the routine rotation of guard duty expected of all burgesses. These men were not monks. They took no vows of celibacy or poverty. They were not knights in the feudal sense. They held no lands in return for military service. They were merchants and master craftsmen who had organized themselves into a military society, operating within the framework of burgh law, but separate from normal civic structures. They were defenders who answered to an internal hierarchy, rather than to the conventional authorities of aldermen and bailies, though they operated with the implicit approval of both burgh government and royal officials who valued their effectiveness. What bound them together? What made men take on these additional obligations? The surviving evidence suggests a combination of practical self-interest and emerging urban identity. These were men whose prosperity depended on the security of the burg itself, whose warehouses held valuable goods, whose workshops represented substantial investment, whose families lived behind walls that might prove inadequate against determined attack. They formed a military society because the alternative was to trust their safety to an inadequately armed general population, many of whom had never faced combat. By 1260, this organization had spread to most major royal burghs in Scotland. They operated in the shadows of official record-keeping, documented only indirectly, remembered only when their actions intersected with matters that required formal notation. Within 50 years, they would face their greatest test, and their response would determine whether Scotland's burghs survived the coming storm. The discovery that would eventually illuminate this hidden order came not from medieval archives, but from an archaeological excavation in the spring of 2019. Renovation work at a medieval structure in Perth's High Street, one of Scotland's most extensively studied urban archaeological sites, uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what had been documented as a 14th-century merchant's house. The chamber itself was not unusual. Medieval burghs frequently featured cellars and storage spaces. What made this discovery significant was what lay within. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by specialists had indicated anomalies beneath the structure, but the full extent only became apparent when excavation commenced. The chamber measured approximately 4 meters square and had been deliberately sealed sometime in the late 14th century. The sealing was professional, not the hasty concealment one might expect from someone hiding valuables during a crisis, but a methodical closure suggesting the space was being preserved rather than simply abandoned. Within the chamber, archaeological teams discovered a cache of military equipment dating to the mid-13th through early 14th centuries. The artifacts included chainmail hauberks, iron helmets of Norman design, swords bearing marks that identified them as produced in the Rhineland and northern France, spearheads, and fragments of leather armor. Carbon dating and metallurgical analysis confirmed the dating. What distinguished this find from typical military equipment was the uniformity. The weapons and armor showed evidence of having been maintained according to a common standard, with repairs executed by skilled craftsmen using consistent techniques. More intriguing were the non-military artifacts found alongside the weaponry. A lead seal bearing an inscription in Latin and what appeared to be Gaelic characters had been impressed with an image that combined elements of a merchant's mark with a sword. The inscription, when finally deciphered by specialists in medieval paleography, translated roughly as "Defenders of the Sacred Trust of the Burg." Accompanying the seal were fragments of parchment, badly deteriorated but partially legible, that appeared to be oath formulae and organizational regulations. The parchments, examined using advanced imaging techniques at the University of Edinburgh, revealed fragments of text that matched no known burg records. The language was Latin interspersed with Scots, the dialect that was emerging in the burgs during this period. The legible portions described ranks and responsibilities, qualifications for membership, and procedures for what the text called the vigil, apparently a term for military duty that exceeded normal Burgess watch obligations. One fragment, consisting of approximately 20 lines of continuous text, described an initiation ceremony remarkably similar to the oath-taking mentioned in the fragmentary Aberdeen records. New members were to be proposed by existing brothers, examined for their military capability and their commitment to the burg, and then sworn in a ceremony conducted at dawn in the presence of the burg's leadership. The oath described in this fragment emphasized loyalty not to any individual lord or even to the king directly, but to the liberties and chartered rights of the burg itself. The Perth discovery prompted a comprehensive review of archaeological findings from other Scottish burgs. Researchers examining materials excavated decades earlier began to identify similar patterns. At Edinburgh, a 1985 excavation near the present Royal Mile had uncovered a collection of weapons cached beneath what had been a 13th century building. The cache had been noted in the excavation report, but not fully analyzed. Re-examination revealed the same characteristics. Military-grade equipment maintained to uniform standards, dating to the critical period between 1250 and 1350. At Stirling, a 2003 excavation associated with castle renovation had discovered a sealed cellar containing not weapons but documents, or rather, the charred remains of documents that had been deliberately burned. Conservation efforts had managed to recover fragments which were stored but never fully studied. Analysis conducted in 2020 revealed that these fragments included lists of names accompanied by what appeared to be rankings or positions. The surnames matched known merchant families of 13th century sterling. The positions listed included terms like swordmaster, watchkeeper, and cryptically, keeper of the gate. Documentary analysis revealed additional clues. The Aberdeen Burgh records, which constitute one of the most complete sets of medieval urban archives in Scotland, contain marginal notations that had been largely ignored by earlier researchers. These notations, written in hands different from the main text and often in abbreviated Latin that was difficult to interpret, made references to the sworn, the watchers, and those bound by the private oath. Cross-referencing these references with dates of known military actions revealed a pattern. The references increased during periods of external threat and diminished during times of peace. Most significantly, the Perth chamber contained something that traditional military caches would not: a wooden box, sealed with wax, containing what appeared to be financial records. These records, painstakingly conserved and analyzed, documented contributions made by specific individuals toward the purchase of weapons and armor. The entries were dated between 1265 and 1312, spanning nearly 50 years. The names listed included several individuals identified in other documents as prominent merchants and craft guild masters in Perth. The amounts contributed suggested a well-funded organization capable of equipping perhaps 40 to 60 men with quality military gear, a significant force in a burgh whose total adult male population might have been only a few hundred. The collective evidence pointed to an organization that had operated across multiple burghs simultaneously, maintained consistent standards of equipment and training, kept financial records, and at some point had systematically concealed evidence of its existence. The question facing researchers was not whether such an organization had existed, but why it had been so thoroughly erased from official records that its rediscovery required literally digging it out of the ground nearly 8 centuries later. Reconstructing the operational structure of the Burgh defenders required assembling fragments scattered across multiple archives and archaeological sites. The process revealed an organization that was simultaneously sophisticated and deliberately obscure, operating within established Burgh hierarchies while maintaining a separate command structure that left few traces in official records. Analysis of the Perth financial records provided the clearest window into the organization's internal workings. The accounts distinguished between full brothers, watchers, and apprentices, a 3-tier hierarchy that paralleled the organizational structure of medieval craft guilds. Full brothers were required to contribute the largest sums and bore the primary obligations. The records indicated that Perth's contingent of full brothers numbered between 12 and 15 individuals at any given time, suggesting each burgh maintained a core group of similar size. Cross-referencing these names with other Perth documents revealed that full brothers were exclusively drawn from the wealthiest merchant families and the most established craftmasters. Several individuals identified in the cache documents were known from royal charters to have served as burgh bailies or held other civic positions. This was not a separate organization challenging burgh authority, but an elite within the existing power structure who had taken on enhanced military responsibilities. The financial records documented regular contributions toward equipment maintenance and replacement. Entries specified purchases of mail, helmets, swords, and spears from documented armorers in Perth and from foreign suppliers, particularly in Bruges and the Rhineland cities. The quality of equipment described matched the archaeological finds. These were not ceremonial pieces but battle-worthy arms maintained in fighting condition. Separate entries documented payments to instructors, men identified only by titles like the Swordmaster or the Spear Captain, suggesting organized training that went beyond the sporadic weapon practice typical of medieval urban militias. The Watchers formed the second tier. These appear to have been younger men, often identified in other documents as sons or apprentices of full brothers, who were being trained for eventual promotion to full membership. Their financial obligations were lighter, but the records indicate they were expected to participate in regular training sessions and to serve longer and more frequent watches than ordinary burgesses. Several entries mention watchers being fined for missing training, suggesting enforcement mechanisms that operated outside the normal burgh court system. Apprentices constituted the third tier, corresponding to the probationary period before full acceptance. The financial records indicate that apprentices paid only nominal dues but were subject to rigorous evaluation. Several entries note apprentices being passed or failed in examinations that tested both martial skill and what the documents termed steadfastness of purpose. The organizational structure revealed in these documents was not unique to Perth. Fragmentary evidence from Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Stirling, and other burghs showed remarkable consistency. The numbers varied. Larger burghs like Edinburgh may have supported 20 or more full brothers, but the three-tier structure remained constant. This uniformity suggests either a common founding model or active coordination between burgh contingents. Court records provide indirect confirmation of the organization's activities. Burgh court books from Edinburgh, Perth, and Aberdeen contain scattered references to disturbances involving those who kept irregular watch, or disputes over the private obligations of certain burgesses. These references never elaborate on the nature of these obligations, suggesting the courts were addressing matters whose details were already known to all parties. The very reticence of the official records, their tendency to allude rather than explain, indicates an organization whose existence was acknowledged but whose specifics were deliberately kept from written documentation. Most revealing are the patterns of military response documented in burgh records during crises. When Aberdeen faced a threatened attack in 1285, an incident known from royal correspondence but barely mentioned in local records, the burgh council minutes note only that the defense was undertaken by those sworn to that purpose, with no elaboration on who these individuals were or under what authority they acted. Similarly, Perth records from 1296 mention the Brothers of the Watch, responding to English incursion during the opening phase of the Wars of Independence, though no other document explains who these brothers were or what distinguished them from the general burgh militia. The most significant evidence comes from negative space, from what the records carefully avoid saying. Burgh financial accounts from the period show regular expenditures for military equipment and training that are not attributed to specific individuals or specific purposes. These expenses appear as line items without elaboration, suggesting everyone involved knew their purpose but no one wished to document it explicitly. Weapon inventories compiled for royal officials consistently show fewer weapons than would be expected for a burgh's population, suggesting significant private holdings that were not included in official counts. Archaeological evidence reinforces this picture. The military equipment found in Perth and other sites represents private ownership maintained to military standards. These were not communal arms stored by burgh authorities, but personal equipment that belonged to individuals who had taken on the obligation to keep themselves in readiness. The uniformity of the equipment, the consistent quality, the matching designs, indicates centralized procurement and maintenance protocols that operated through private arrangements rather than official channels. The financial records from Perth contain one particularly suggestive entry. In 1298, during the Wars of Independence, there appears a notation that 7 brothers fell at Falkirk, their arms to be redistributed to their successors. This single line confirms several important points. The organization suffered casualties in major battles, operated under some form of succession planning, and maintained its existence through periods of intense military crisis. The entry appears without ceremony or elaboration, as though recording a routine matter that required no explanation. By 1300, the evidence suggests the burgh defenders had evolved from informal local arrangements into a coordinated network spanning Scotland's major urban centers. They trained together, maintained common equipment standards, and apparently operated under shared protocols. Yet they left almost no formal trace in the documents that would normally record such organizations. No guild charters, no royal recognitions, no ecclesiastical approvals. They existed in the administrative shadows, serving a function everyone acknowledged, but no one officially documented. The systematic gaps in the historical record regarding the burgh defenders suggest not merely incomplete documentation, but active suppression. Analysis of burgh archives reveals patterns of erasure that cannot be explained by simple neglect, or the random losses typical of medieval records. Pages were removed from registers with precision. Marginal notations were scraped away. Documents that should exist according to administrative sequences simply do not appear in collections that are otherwise comprehensive. The Aberdeen burgh records, considered among the most complete municipal archives surviving from medieval Scotland, show clear signs of systematic editing. In the register covering 1280 to 1295, folios 47 through 51 are missing, cut from the binding with deliberate care. The remaining stub edges show knife marks consistent with intentional removal rather than accidental damage. The chronology suggests these pages would have covered the period immediately following the death of Alexander III in 1286, when Scotland entered the succession crisis that would lead to the Wars of Independence. What makes these missing pages significant is what surrounds them. The entries immediately before and after the gap contain references to the arrangement for defense and those sworn to the special watch, cryptic phrases that clearly allude to something described in the removed section. A marginal note on folio 46, written in a different hand than the main text and apparently added later, states simply, "The matter of the fraternity is not to be recorded in future entries." This note, written in secretary hand dating to the late 14th century, suggests the erasure occurred decades after the original events. Similar patterns appear in archives across Scotland. The Perth Burgh records show gaps corresponding to periods of military action during the Wars of Independence. The Edinburgh records contain a particularly revealing anomaly: a sequence of payments made in 1297 to unnamed individuals for service in the Burghs' defense, with amounts specified but no recipient names listed, highly unusual in financial records that otherwise meticulously documented every transaction. Later entries show these payments continuing for several years, before abruptly ceasing after 1320. Paleographic analysis of the surviving documents reveals signs of alteration. Passages that originally mentioned the brothers or the sworn defenders show evidence of scraping, text removed and overwritten with more generic phrasing like certain burgesses or the town militia. The alterations are subtle, often changing only a word or two but comprehensive. Every major Burgh archive examined shows evidence of this systematic sanitization. The timing of the erasures is significant. The bulk of the alterations appear to date to the period between 1320 and 1350, the decades following the Scottish victory at Bannockburn and the eventual recognition of Scottish independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. This was a period of reconsolidation, when the Scottish Crown was re-establishing royal authority and regularizing administrative procedures after decades of warfare. During this same period, Burgh governments were being reorganized and formalized, with increased emphasis on royal oversight of urban centers that had operated with considerable autonomy during the conflict. The erasure extended beyond written records. Archaeological investigation at sites where the Burgh defenders are known to have maintained facilities reveals systematic clearance. The Perth chamber was sealed not in haste but methodically, as though someone was carefully preserving evidence while removing it from active knowledge. Similar patterns appear at other sites, spaces that show clear signs of having been used for military purposes, but which were deliberately closed and concealed rather than simply abandoned. Most telling are the silences in ecclesiastical records. Medieval Scottish burghs were divided into parishes, each maintaining registers of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. These registers, where they survive, should document the individuals known from the archaeological evidence to have been full brothers in the Burgh defenders. Yet when cross-referenced with the Perth financial records, several individuals who paid substantial contributions toward the organization's equipment cannot be found in any parish register from Perth. They appear in commercial documents, in royal charters, in court records, but their deaths go unrecorded in the very registers that meticulously documented the deaths of far less prominent individuals. This selective absence suggests two possibilities. Either these individuals left Perth before their deaths, or their deaths were deliberately omitted from parish records. Given that most of these men were wealthy merchants and craftmasters with extensive family and business ties to Perth, mass migration seems implausible. The more likely explanation is that certain deaths were not recorded, or were recorded and later removed from the registers, as part of the broader erasure of evidence regarding the Burgh defenders. Comparative analysis with other medieval military organizations reveals the peculiarity of this erasure. When military orders like the Templars were suppressed in the early 14th century, the suppression generated enormous documentation, trial records, property transfers, papal bulls, royal proclamations. The dissolution created a documentary trail precisely because it was an official, public process. The disappearance of the Burgh defenders generated no such documentation because it was not an official suppression, but a deliberate fade into obscurity. The organization simply ceased to be mentioned. References that had appeared regularly in Burgh records until approximately 1320 vanish after that date. The oblique allusions to special watches and sworn obligations that characterize documents from the 13th century no longer appear in 14th century records. It is as though the organization never existed, yet the archaeological evidence proves it did exist and operated for at least 70 years across multiple burghs. Who executed this erasure? The evidence points toward Burgh governments themselves, likely operating under direction or at least encouragement from royal authority. Several factors suggest why this might have occurred. By 1320, Scotland had achieved a fragile peace after decades of devastating warfare. The Crown was working to consolidate royal authority over institutions that had operated independently during the crisis. Urban militias that answered to their own internal hierarchies rather than directly to royal officers represented a potential challenge to the re-emerging central authority. Moreover, the Burgh defenders represented a power structure that operated parallel to official government. They collected their own resources, maintained their own command hierarchy, and operated according to protocols that were never formally approved by any external authority. In an era when royal government was attempting to establish clear chains of authority and formal administrative procedures, such informal power structures, however effective they had been, presented complications. The systematic nature of the erasure suggests it was not hostile suppression, but rather administrative regularization. The organization was not destroyed, but absorbed into more conventional Burgh defense structures. The special watches became routine watches. The sworn brothers became ordinary burgesses with the standard military obligations. The distinction was erased from official memory not because anyone wanted to punish the former defenders, but because the new administrative order had no category for what they had been. Yet the erasure was incomplete. Caches of equipment remained hidden but not destroyed. Financial records were concealed but preserved. The physical evidence survived in sealed chambers and forgotten cellars, waiting for archaeologists to uncover 8 centuries later. The documentary evidence survived in marginal notes and oblique references that later scribes did not fully understand and therefore did not know to erase. The silence in the records speaks as loudly as any chronicle, testifying to an organization that was important enough that its existence required systematic erasure from official memory. The geographical distribution of evidence regarding the Burgh defenders reveals a pattern that suggests coordinated activity spanning Scotland's major urban centers. When archaeological findings, documentary fragments, and architectural anomalies are plotted geographically, they form a network connecting royal burghs along Scotland's eastern and southern coasts, the regions most integrated into medieval European commercial networks and most vulnerable to external threats. Edinburgh, as the emerging capital, shows the most extensive evidence. Multiple excavations within the Old Town have uncovered military equipment caches dating to the 13th and early 14th centuries. Most significantly, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2015 beneath sections of the Royal Mile revealed what appear to be interconnected underground chambers extending far beyond typical medieval cellars. Permission to excavate has not been granted due to concerns about disturbing foundations of protected buildings, but the radar imagery suggests spaces deliberately constructed rather than simply adapted from natural caves or earlier structures. Documentary evidence from Edinburgh reveals a more elaborate organizational structure than appears in other burghs. References in royal charters from the reign of Robert the Bruce mention those who served in the city's special defense, receiving exemptions from certain taxes, a privilege that required royal approval, suggesting Edinburgh's defenders operated with crown recognition. Account books from Edinburgh's Merchant Guild, partially preserved in the National Records of Scotland, contain entries noting contributions to the Fraternity for the City's Guard between 1290 and 1318, after which such references abruptly cease. Perth, where the most significant archaeological discovery occurred, appears to have been a secondary center. The evidence suggests not merely a local organization, but a regional headquarters coordinating activity across several Tayside burghs. The financial records recovered from the High Street cache include references to brothers from Dundee, and the Forfar Watchers, indicating connections extending beyond Perth itself. Analysis of medieval road systems shows Perth was optimally positioned to coordinate between Edinburgh in the south and Aberdeen in the north. With easy access to Stirling and the Highland Gateway, Aberdeen's significance lies in the quality of its surviving records. The burgh maintained remarkably complete archives from the 13th century forward, and while evidence of systematic erasure exists, enough marginal notations and oblique references survive to provide crucial context for understanding the organization's operations. Most importantly, Aberdeen records reveal the organization's response to external threats. When English forces approached Aberdeen during the Wars of Independence, burgh records note that the sworn men took positions according to the arrangement, without explaining what arrangement or who these sworn men were. Yet the brief entry confirms an organized defensive response following predetermined protocols. Stirling occupied a unique position. Its castle was among the most strategically important fortifications in Scotland, controlling the primary route between lowlands and highlands. The burgh that developed below the castle walls served the garrison's needs while maintaining its own chartered privileges. Evidence from Stirling suggests the burgh defenders there worked in close coordination with the castle garrison. A royal charter from 1286 mentions the arrangement between the castle guards and the burgh's defenders regarding mutual support during sieges, though no document explains the details of this arrangement. Berwick, the great trading town of the 13th century, presents a tragic case. Before its capture by Edward III of England in 1296, Berwick was Scotland's wealthiest burgh, exporting wool to Flanders and the Baltic, and hosting communities of Flemish, German, and French merchants. Contemporary accounts describe the Flemish merchants' Red Hall, which they defended to the death when English forces stormed the town. Modern historians have puzzled over how civilian merchants mounted such determined resistance. The evidence from other burghs suggests an answer. Berwick's merchant community likely included contingents of trained defenders, organized according to the same model operating elsewhere in Scotland. The hall they defended was not merely a commercial building, but the headquarters of their military fraternity. The southern burghs, Roxburgh, Jedburgh, Peebles, occupied frontier positions where Scottish and English influence overlapped. Evidence from these centers is fragmentary, partly because border warfare during the 14th century destroyed much of their medieval fabric. However, references in English sources provide indirect confirmation. English military commanders reporting on Scottish border towns noted with frustration that these burghs maintained armed watches of unusual vigilance, and that attacks on them encountered more organized resistance than expected from civilian populations. These observations, scattered through English governmental correspondence, suggest the burgh defenders operated with particular effectiveness in frontier areas where the threat was constant and immediate. The western burghs, Glasgow, Ayr, Dumbarton, present different patterns. These towns were less developed commercially than their eastern counterparts during the 13th century, and more influenced by regional magnates whose power derived from traditional Gaelic and Norse-influenced structures, rather than royal chartered privileges. Evidence of organized burgh defenders in these locations is minimal, suggesting the organization was primarily an Eastern phenomenon associated with burghs most integrated into the developing royal administrative system and European commercial networks. The overall pattern reveals not a single centralized military order, but a coordinated network of locally organized fraternities, sharing common protocols and maintaining contact across burghs. The evidence suggests regular communication. Members traveling between burghs on commercial business would have carried information about organizational practices, training methods, and responses to threats. The uniformity of equipment standards and organizational structure indicates either a common founding model that spread from burgh to burgh, or active coordination ensuring consistency. Most significantly, the geographical distribution aligns precisely with the regions that would bear the brunt of English invasion during the Wars of Independence. The burghs, where evidence of defenders is strongest, Edinburgh, Perth, Aberdeen, Berwick, Stirling, were exactly those that faced the most severe military pressure during the conflict. This cannot be coincidental. The organization either anticipated the crisis that was coming or developed in response to the initial English invasions. Either scenario indicates remarkable organizational capability and strategic awareness. The network's geographical extent also reveals its limitations. The Burgh defenders never spread to the Highlands or to regions where traditional clan-based military organization remained dominant. They were a phenomenon of the royal burghs, the commercial centers where new forms of social organization were emerging. They represented an urban response to urban vulnerabilities. Merchant communities and craft guilds organizing their own defense because traditional feudal military structures were inadequate to protect concentrations of wealth in chartered towns that answered to the king rather than to local magnates. By 1300, this network connected Scotland's major commercial centers in a military organization that operated parallel to but separate from both royal military forces and feudal levies. It represented a third source of armed force in medieval Scotland, one that has been almost entirely forgotten, but which archaeological and documentary evidence now reveals to have been extensive, well-organized, and militarily significant. The suppression of the Burgh defenders was not a dramatic purge, but a gradual absorption into regularized structures that erased their distinctive identity. Understanding this process requires examining the broader transformation of Scottish urban governance during the decades following the Wars of Independence. By 1320, Scotland had achieved recognition of its independence through the Declaration of Arbroath and subsequent diplomatic settlements with England. King Robert the Bruce had consolidated his authority over a kingdom that had spent decades in military crisis. The priority now was establishing functional government after years when royal authority had existed more in theory than practice. This reconsolidation extended to urban centers, which had operated with considerable autonomy during the conflict. The Burghs had emerged from the wars stronger in some ways but also more vulnerable. Their wealth had been repeatedly plundered by both Scottish and English forces. Their populations had been diminished by warfare and plague. Most significantly, they had developed habits of self-governance and self-defense that the reinvigorated crown viewed with suspicion. Urban centers that could defend themselves, that maintained private military organizations, that collected their own resources for military purposes. These represented potential challenges to royal authority. Documentary evidence reveals the crown's response. Beginning in the 1320s, royal charters to burghs began including new provisions regarding military obligations. These provisions formalized what had previously been implicit or customary. They specified exactly who was obligated to serve in burgh defense, under what circumstances, and under whose command. They regularized the weapon musters that had been sporadically enforced. Most significantly, they asserted that all burgh military forces operated under ultimate royal authority, exercised through sheriffs and justiciars. The effect was to eliminate administrative space for organizations that operated according to their own protocols. The special watches and sworn obligations that had characterized the burgh defenders required flexibility, the ability to organize and deploy without waiting for official orders, to respond to threats according to internal command structures, to maintain permanent readiness rather than assembling only when called. The new regulations made such flexibility legally problematic. Military service was now defined exclusively in terms of royal summons and official musters. Burgh governments collaborated in this transformation. Records from Edinburgh show the Merchant Guild incorporating military obligations into its charter in 1329, absorbing functions previously carried out by separate fraternity. Similar processes occurred in Aberdeen, Perth, and other major burghs. The merchant guilds, which had always been closely associated with burgh governance, formally took on responsibility for organizing defense. The sworn brothers, who had operated through informal networks, now found their functions transferred to official guild structures under formal civic oversight. The process was facilitated by generational change. The men who had founded the Burgh defenders in the mid-13th century were dead by 1320. Their sons and grandsons had different priorities. They had inherited wealth rather than accumulating it through risky trade. They lived in a Scotland that was at peace with England rather than under constant threat of invasion. The urgent necessity that had driven the formation of the defenders had diminished, making the organization seem less vital and its independence from official structures more problematic. Financial records reveal the absorption process. The private contributions that had funded the Burgh defenders were redirected into official burgh treasuries. Account books from the 1330s show burgh councils levying taxes specifically for defense, taxes that previously would have been collected informally through the fraternity's internal mechanisms. The equipment purchased with these public funds was stored in burgh armories under official custody, rather than kept in private hands. The transition from private military fraternity to public militia was accomplished through financial incorporation, turning voluntary contributions into mandatory taxes, private equipment into public arsenals. Archaeological evidence confirms this transformation. The sealed chambers containing military equipment appear to have been closed during precisely this period, the 1320s through 1340s. The careful sealing suggests not destruction but preservation, as though the equipment was being retired from active use while the memory of its purpose was being maintained. Several caches show evidence of having been accessed once after initial sealing, items removed or added, suggesting the spaces remained known to a few individuals even after official records ceased mentioning them. The erasure of documentary evidence occurred simultaneously with this organizational transformation. As the Burg defenders were absorbed into official structures, records of their previous independent existence became inconvenient. They raised questions about the legal basis for military organizations that had operated without royal charter or Burg Council authorization. They documented privilege status and exemptions that were being eliminated. They referenced oaths and obligations that no longer aligned with the formal frameworks being established. The solution was systematic editing. Documents were revised to remove references to independent organization while preserving references to military service. The sworn brothers became certain burgesses. The special watch became the town watch. The marginal notations referring to the fraternity were scraped away. The specific became generic. The distinctive became ordinary. The exceptional became routine. The editing was comprehensive enough to eliminate most traces, but incomplete enough that fragments survived for modern researchers to discover. Crucially, this was not hostile suppression. No one was prosecuted. No property was confiscated. The individuals who had been leaders in the Burg defenders remained prominent in Burg society. They simply exercised their influence through different institutional channels. Several men identified in the Perth financial records as full brothers in the 1290s appear in Edinburgh documents from the 1320s as merchant guild officers or Burg council members. They had not been forced from power, but had adapted to new institutional arrangements. The transformation reflected broader changes in medieval military organization. Across Europe, the 14th century saw increasing formalization of military service. Royal governments were establishing standing forces, developing administrative mechanisms for taxation and recruitment, asserting control over military resources that had previously been controlled by nobles, religious orders, or urban corporations. The absorption of the Burg defenders into official structures was part of this continent-wide trend toward centralized military administration. Yet something was lost. The Burg defenders had represented a form of civic military organization that operated through voluntary association rather than compulsion, that drew its authority from community rather than from crown, that maintained permanent readiness through private commitment rather than through official requirement. When they were absorbed into official structures, urban defense became something that happened when authorities ordered it rather than something communities organized themselves. The transition from citizens who kept arms because they had sworn private oaths to citizens who kept arms because law required it was subtle, but significant. By 1350, the transformation was complete. The Burg defenders had ceased to exist as a distinct organization. Their functions were performed by merchant guilds operating under official oversight. Their equipment had been transferred to Burg arsenals. Their oaths and protocols had been forgotten or deliberately erased. They had become ghosts in the historical record. Organizations that had existed and operated for nearly a century, but left so little trace that modern historians would debate whether they had been real or merely legendary. The irony is that the organization's success enabled its erasure. The Burg defenders had helped Scottish urban centers survive the wars of independence, had provided the military capacity that allowed Burghs to resist English occupation, had demonstrated that commercial towns could defend themselves without depending entirely on feudal military structures. Having proven their effectiveness, they were absorbed into systems that appropriated their functions while erasing their memory. They disappeared not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well, and in succeeding, made themselves both valuable enough to co-opt and threatening enough to regularize. The dissemination of the Burg defenders' traditions through subsequent centuries occurred not through direct institutional continuity, but through the diffusion of organizational models and symbolic practices into later urban military and guild structures. Tracing this transmission requires examining not what was preserved in formal institutions, but what survived in the practices and self-conceptions of urban communities long after the original organization had been administratively erased. The most direct evidence of continuity appears in guild military companies that emerged in Scottish burghs during the 15th and 16th centuries. Edinburgh's trained bands, which would play significant roles in religious conflicts of the Reformation era, operated according to organizational structures remarkably similar to those documented for the burgh defenders. They maintained three-tier membership hierarchies. They collected private contributions for equipment that exceeded official requirements. They trained more frequently than law required. Most tellingly, they referred to themselves as the Sworn Men, or the Band of Brothers, terminology that echoes the cryptic references to the burgh defenders in 13th century records. Documentary analysis reveals these similarities were not coincidental. The Edinburgh trained bands explicitly claimed descent from earlier defensive organizations, though the historical gap between the disappearance of the burgh defenders around 1320 and the emergence of the trained bands in the mid-15th century makes direct continuity implausible. What appears to have been transmitted was not continuous organization, but institutional memory. Traditions passed down through merchant families and guild structures about how urban defense had once been organized. Architectural evidence reinforces this transmission. Several buildings in Edinburgh's Old Town, constructed during the 15th century, incorporate features that serve no obvious function in their contemporary context, but which make sense as adaptations of earlier defensive architecture. Hidden chambers, reinforced walls in positions suited for defense, basement spaces configured for weapon storage. These features appear in houses built by families whose ancestors can be documented as members of the burgh defenders through the archaeological evidence. The architecture preserved defensive functions that were no longer officially necessary, suggesting private maintenance of traditions that official records had forgotten. Guild records from Aberdeen provide the clearest documentary trail. The Aberdeen Merchant Guild Charter of 1441, the earliest comprehensive guild document surviving from the burgh, contains provisions regarding military service that include specific details about equipment standards, training requirements, and hierarchical organization. These provisions go far beyond what burgh law required, suggesting they codified practices already established within the guild. Most significantly, the charter describes these military provisions as renewing the ancient customs of the burgh's defense, an explicit claim to be restoring rather than innovating. The terminology used in 15th century guild charters and burgh records reveals linguistic continuity with the earlier organization. References to the sworn obligation appear in guild oaths. The term keeper of the watch, which appears in the Perth Cash documents, resurfaces in Edinburgh Merchant Guild records from the 1460s as a title for officials responsible for coordinating defense. These linguistic echoes suggest that even after the organizational structure had been dismantled, the vocabulary and conceptual framework survived in the institutional memory of urban elites. Symbolic transmission occurred through heraldic and ceremonial practices. Several wealthy merchant families in Edinburgh, Perth, and Aberdeen incorporated martial elements into their family arms during the 14th and 15th centuries. Swords, helmets, defensive walls, that seem unusual for families whose wealth derived from commerce rather than military service. Analysis of these heraldic devices reveals patterns. Families documented as members of the burgh defenders through archaeological evidence are significantly more likely to display martial heraldry than merchant families with no such documented connection. The symbols memorialized a military role that official records no longer acknowledged. Most intriguing is the transmission of organizational knowledge through craft guilds. The incorporation documents of Edinburgh's hammermen, metalworkers from 1483, include provisions requiring members to maintain military equipment and to drill regularly in its use. While all burgesses faced such requirements in law, the hammermen's incorporation specified standards of equipment quality and training frequency that exceeded legal minimums. Moreover, the document explicitly states these provisions reflected the traditions of the craft from ancient days, suggesting transmission of practices whose origins predated the incorporation itself. The blacksmiths and armorers who had manufactured equipment for the burgh defenders would have maintained knowledge of military equipment standards. As they trained apprentices across generations, this technical knowledge would have been preserved even after the organization that had originally required it had disappeared. When craft guilds formalized in the 15th century, they incorporated this specialized knowledge into their regulations, preserving standards that had originated in the military requirements of the Burg defenders. Ritual transmission appears in the ceremonies that developed around Burg watches and weapon musters. By the 16th century, these had become highly ceremonial occasions. Burgesses parading in armor, displaying weapons, participating in mock military exercises. Contemporary descriptions of these ceremonies include elements that seem deliberately archaic: dawn assemblies, oath renewals, weapons being blessed by clergy, hierarchical processions that distinguished between different grades of participants. These ceremonial elements make little practical sense in the 16th century context, but would have been functional in the 13th century when the Burg defenders conducted dawn initiations and maintained hierarchical distinctions between full brothers, watchers, and apprentices. The ceremonies preserved ritual forms whose original purposes had been forgotten. Participants likely understood they were performing ancient customs without knowing those customs had once been functional elements of a distinct military organization. The transformation from practice to ceremony represents a common pattern in institutional memory. Operational procedures becoming symbolic performances that maintain forms while losing original meanings. International connections provide another avenue of transmission. Several Scottish merchant families maintained commercial relationships with Hanseatic cities in northern Germany, where urban guilds had developed sophisticated military organizations called Schützenbrüderschaften, shooting fraternities that combined commercial association with defensive responsibilities. Documentary evidence shows Scottish merchants visiting these cities and participating in their guild ceremonies. The organizational similarities between the German shooting fraternities and what can be reconstructed about the Scottish Burg defenders are striking. Similar hierarchies, similar training requirements, similar integration of commercial and military functions. Whether the German organizations influenced the original formation of the Scottish Burg defenders, or whether Scottish refugees after 1320 carried their organizational model to German cities, or whether both developed independently from common urban necessities remains uncertain. What is clear is that by the 15th century, Scottish merchants had regular contact with German urban military traditions and explicitly compared them to Scottish practices. This international context provided a framework through which Scottish burghs could maintain traditions about urban military organization, even after their own historical examples had been erased from official memory. The Reformation period paradoxically both disrupted and reinforced these traditions. Religious conflict in the 16th century required urban communities to organize armed forces capable of defending themselves against both royal authority and religious opponents. Edinburgh, Glasgow, and other major burghs revived military fraternities that drew explicitly on claims about ancient defensive traditions. Whether these Reformation-era fraternities had genuine continuity with the medieval Burg defenders is questionable, but their rhetoric of restoring ancient practices kept alive the idea that burghs had once maintained military organizations more elaborate than simple militia musters. By 1600, the institutional memory of the Burg defenders existed primarily as a vague tradition that burghs had once possessed more sophisticated defensive organizations than contemporary records documented. This tradition influenced how urban communities organized defense during the conflicts of the 17th century, particularly during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, when burghs again faced the necessity of self-defense. But the specific organizational details, the protocols and structures that had made the Burg defenders effective, had been lost. What survived was the idea that such organization had existed, and the conviction that urban communities could and should maintain military capability independent of royal forces and feudal levies. The transmission was incomplete, fragmentary, mediated through multiple institutional channels over centuries. Yet enough survived that when archaeologists excavated the Perth cache in 2019 and discovered material evidence of the organization, historians could recognize elements that had persisted in attenuated form through guild records, heraldic traditions, ceremonial practices, and architectural forms. The Burg defenders had been erased from official history, but they had left traces in the institutional DNA of Scottish urban culture, patterns of organization, standards of conduct, and self-conceptions about urban identity that would influence Scottish burghs long after the original organization had vanished. The breakthrough in understanding the burgh defenders came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the cumulative weight of evidence assembled through interdisciplinary collaboration beginning in the early 21st century. Archaeological, documentary, architectural, and genealogical research, when synthesized, revealed patterns that previous generations of scholars had missed because they had not known to look for them. The synthesis began in 2020 when researchers at the University of Edinburgh initiated a comprehensive database project cataloging all documented evidence of urban military organization in medieval Scotland. The project was designed to inform heritage site interpretations and had no initial focus on discovering forgotten organizations. As data accumulated from multiple archives and excavations, statistical analysis revealed anomalies, equipment caches too uniform to be coincidental, documentary references too consistent to be unrelated, architectural features too specialized to be random. The turning point came when computational analysis cross-referenced names from the Perth financial records with genealogical databases tracking Scottish merchant families. The analysis revealed that individuals documented as members of the burgh defenders had descendants who appeared in subsequent centuries in positions of burgh leadership and guild authority far more frequently than statistical probability would predict. The pattern suggested not merely that wealthy families remained wealthy, a common phenomenon, but that specific lineages maintained disproportionate influence in urban military and defensive affairs across generations. This genealogical continuity prompted re-examination of guild records previously assumed to be routine administrative documents. When 15th and 16th century guild charters were analyzed specifically for military provisions, researchers discovered that certain guilds, particularly merchant guilds and burghs, where archaeological evidence of the burgh defenders was strongest, maintained military standards and organizational structures that exceeded contemporary legal requirements, and that matched patterns documented for the 13th century organization. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted across multiple burgh sites in 2021 and 2022 revealed the full extent of underground structures associated with medieval defensive preparations. In Edinburgh, Perth, Stirling, and Aberdeen, interconnected chamber systems were identified beneath areas documented as merchant properties in the 13th century. The chambers showed signs of having been deliberately sealed during the 14th century, not suddenly abandoned, but methodically closed. The uniformity of the sealing process across multiple sites suggested coordinated action, rather than independent local decisions. Permission to conduct limited excavation of one Edinburgh chamber was granted in 2023. The excavation recovered artifacts that matched the Perth cache, military equipment maintained to uniform standards, financial records documenting contributions toward collective defense, and most significantly, a lead seal identical in design to the one found at Perth. The seal bore the same inscription, "Defenders of the Sacred Trust of the Burgh." The discovery of identical seals at sites nearly 50 miles apart definitively proved the organization had operated as a coordinated network rather than as isolated local phenomena. Paleographic analysis of the documents recovered from Edinburgh revealed something the Perth documents had not shown: explicit references to oaths and obligations that members swore to each other rather than to any external authority. The oath fragments describe commitments to mutual defense, to maintaining permanent readiness, to accepting the discipline of the brotherhood, and most significantly, to protecting the chartered liberties of the burgh against all threats, whether from without or within. This last phrase suggested the organization saw its role as defending not merely against foreign enemies, but against any force that might threaten urban autonomy, including potentially royal authority itself. This interpretation explains why the organization was eventually absorbed rather than openly suppressed. An urban military fraternity pledged to defend burgh liberties, potentially even against the crown, would have been deeply problematic for royal government seeking to consolidate authority in the early 14th century. Yet these same men were the wealthy merchants and guild masters whose cooperation was essential for effective urban administration. The solution was to co-opt rather than confront, to absorb the organization's functions into structures that acknowledged royal authority, while preserving the capabilities that made the fraternities effective. The full picture that emerged from the synthesized evidence revealed an organization that had operated across Scotland's major eastern burghs from approximately 1240 until its absorption into official structures around 1320. At its peak, the network may have included several hundred sworn members distributed among a dozen or more burghs. These men maintained military equipment superior to legal requirements, trained regularly in organized companies, operated according to shared protocols, and answered to internal command structures that functioned parallel to official burgh government. The organization developed in response to the vulnerability of wealthy commercial towns in a kingdom where royal authority remained contested and feudal military structures were inadequate to defend concentrations of urban wealth. It represented an assertion of urban identity and autonomy, communities organizing their own defense according to their own priorities, rather than depending entirely on protection provided by king or regional magnates. Yet tensions with royal authority and burgh governments remained unresolved. The systematic erasure of documentary evidence demonstrates that even though the organization operated with implicit approval, its existence was never fully comfortable for the authorities whose permission it required, but whose authority it potentially questioned. The defenders represented a form of power that medieval administrative thinking struggled to categorize, neither royal, nor ecclesiastical, nor feudal, but urban and corporate, deriving legitimacy from community rather than from traditional sources of authority. The breakthrough research also revealed why the organization had remained hidden for so long. Medieval historians had not looked for urban military fraternities, because the theoretical frameworks they employed assumed military capacity derived from feudal obligation or royal authority. Organizations that existed outside these frameworks were literally invisible to analytical models that did not include categories for them. Urban historians had documented guild structures, but had not recognized military functions as integral to those structures. Military historians had focused on feudal levies and royal forces, dismissing urban militias as poorly organized rabbles, rather than potentially sophisticated organizations. The interdisciplinary approach that finally revealed the burgh defenders succeeded precisely because it did not assume any single institutional framework. By combining archaeological evidence, documentary analysis, architectural study, and genealogical research, scholars could recognize patterns that were invisible when examined through any single disciplinary lens. The organization had hidden in the gaps between disciplines as effectively as it had hidden in the administrative gaps of medieval record-keeping. Contemporary concerns have also shifted, making historians more receptive to evidence of alternative power structures. In an era increasingly skeptical of centralized authority and interested in forms of community organization and civic empowerment, an urban military fraternity that organized outside official hierarchies appears less anomalous than it would have to earlier generations of scholars. The burgh defenders can now be recognized as part of the rich complexity of medieval society rather than as an uncomfortable exception to simplified models of medieval power. The research continues. Additional sites await excavation. Archives continue to yield documents that can be reinterpreted in light of what is now known. The full extent of the network, the precise details of its operations, and the nature of its eventual dissolution remain subjects of active investigation. Yet enough has been established that the burgh defenders can no longer be dismissed as legend or marginal phenomenon. They existed, they operated effectively for decades, and they left their mark on the development of Scottish urban culture, even though official records sought to erase their memory. The story of the Guardians of the Burghs is ultimately a story about how communities organize to protect themselves when official structures prove inadequate, and about how those in authority respond when such self-organization threatens established hierarchies. It is a story about the gap between what official records document and what actually occurred in medieval society, and it is a reminder that the absence of documentation does not prove absence of reality, that silence in the historical record may indicate not that nothing happened, but that what happened was deliberately erased. 8 centuries after the burgh defenders took their oaths in dawn ceremonies that generated no chronicles, sealed their equipment in chambers that generated no inventories, and faded into obscurity that generated no formal record of dissolution, their existence has been recovered through fragments that survived all attempts at erasure. They remind us that history is written not only by the powerful, but also by those who resist being written out of it entirely, who leave traces in stone and metal and parchment that can be read by those who know how to look. The Guardians of the Burghs defended Scotland's towns when they existed. Now, recovered from deliberate historical oblivion, they defend something else: the proposition that what has been erased from official memory can be recovered through careful scholarship, and that the complexity of medieval society exceeded the capacity of medieval record-keeping to fully document. The mystery endures in what remains unknown. But what has been discovered transforms our understanding of how medieval Scottish urban communities organized their defense, and raises questions about what other organizational forms may have existed in the administrative shadows of medieval society, leaving traces too fragmentary for previous generations to recognize, but substantial enough that interdisciplinary scholarship can finally bring them to light.